Today is May 4th, 2022, and my guest is journalist and author Matti Friedman. His latest book, which is our subject for today, is Who by Fire? Leonard Cohen in the Sinai. I want to let listeners know that today's conversation may contain adult themes. Matti, welcome to EconTalk.
Thanks so much for having me.
This is an amazing book. It's a small masterpiece. It's not very long. It's under 200 pages. It's about Leonard Cohen. It's about Israel. It's about war, poetry, music, and overarching the whole thing is the pull of tribe, which I have been interested in for quite some time on the program, as listeners know. And I've asked Matti to create a Spotify playlist of Leonard Cohen songs and songs related to Israel that might be relevant. So you're free to either listen to that on its own or listen in the background as you listen to our conversation. We'll put a link to that playlist at the website for this episode. So let's start with who Leonard Cohen was. Who was Leonard Cohen?
Leonard Cohen was one of the great stars of the 60s. He kind of came out of the same folk music scene that many of your listeners probably remember, people like Joan Baez and Judy Collins, and he was very much part of the bohemian scene in Greenwich Village in the late 60s. He's, of course, the mind behind some pretty great hits, Suzanne, So Long, Marianne, Hey, That's No Way to Say Goodbye, just to name a few. So many of us probably remember Leonard Cohen in the later stages of his career, when he's an elderly gentleman playing to packed stadiums across the world. But the Leonard Cohen of 1973, the Leonard Cohen of this story, is quite a young man. He's 39, deeply unhappy, feels like he's at a creative dead end. He's actually announced that he's retiring. So he's kind of a star who's in a rut. He's kind of hit a brick wall, and that's where the war catches him.
And many listeners, I suspect, will only know one song of Leonard Cohen, although they won't know it's Leonard Cohen necessarily, and that's Hallelujah, which has been covered a zillion times. It's a very popular song on shows like American Idol, and that song, of course, is written way after the period we're talking about, along with a number of his some of his darker songs, and we will talk about that. So this is a story that's set in 1973, and in 1973, what's happening in Israel?
So 1973, and I think you remember some of this, Russ, because I know you lived in Israel as a child in those years between the Six-Day War of 1967 and the Yom Kippur War of 1973. But these are very upbeat years in Israel. The victory of 1967 saw Israel defeat three Arab armies, the Syrian army, the Jordanian army, and the Egyptian army. Israel captures the Golan Heights and the West Bank and the old city of Jerusalem and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. And this is a great victory that leads to a period of euphoria in Israel. So the country really feels very confident. They've pulled off this great military victory, and people, I think, get a bit confused about the actual direction of things. Israel becomes overconfident, and this all comes crashing down on October 6, 1973, when the Yom Kippur War begins. It's also worth pointing out that in Israel, 1973 is still the 60s. So, that kind of communal feeling of the 60s, even the music of the 60s, it was still going on in Israel in 1973. In those years, everything reached Israel late. So cultural trends, that were already, old in America hadn't yet arrived in Israel. So for most Americans, the 60s ended, I guess, with that famous Rolling Stones show that goes awry at the Altamont Speedway, and the Summer of Love by 1973 is a distant memory. It's 4 years earlier, but that hasn't reached Israel yet. So the 60s are still going on, and in Israel, the 60s really end with the Yom Kippur War in a kind of metaphysical way. October 6, 1973 is really a turning point for Israel in many ways.
I want to recommend to listeners two books we'll link to. Abraham Rabinovich's book of the Yom Kippur War and Michael Oren's book of the Six-Day War, 6 Days of War. They're both fantastic historical accounts of these two wars in that period in between. I lived in Israel at the age of 15 in 1971. before we started recording, Matti said, "Oh, that was the idyllic time," and of course, I didn't know that. It just was 1971, but it did come crashing down. So, what happens in 1973 on Yom Kippur, the holiest day of the year for Jews, and both in Israel, it's often observed by both religious and non-religious Jews.
Right. Everyone feels Yom Kippur in Israel, even people who aren't necessarily religious or observant. Most of the time, people tend to fast, which is part of the tradition of Yom Kippur. Many people go to synagogue. And the idea of Yom Kippur, which literally means the Day of Atonement, is to think about your actions in the preceding year and look ahead to the coming year. And we have this idea that people's fates are sealed on Yom Kippur, that you have until the end of Yom Kippur to properly atone for the sins of the preceding year before your fate is sealed for the coming year. And there's a prayer at the heart of the Yom Kippur service that really makes that explicit, that says, today God is sitting in judgment and he's going to decide who will live and who will die, who by water and who by fire. And the prayer goes on. So that's a key idea for people observing Yom Kippur. In practice, what Yom Kippur looks like in Israel is it's completely quiet. So it's quite eerie if you're not used to it. The streets are empty. The busiest highways are completely empty. No one drives on the roads. There are no flights in and out of the airport. There's no TV broadcasts. There's no radio broadcasts. The country really goes completely silent for 24 hours. And that was the scene in Israel on Yom Kippur on October 6, 1973, when the war breaks out at 2 p.m. with a surprise attack on two fronts, one in Egypt and one in Syria.
And Israel's completely unprepared. There, of course, in every war, you can always find things after the fact. Oh, there was this piece of evidence, but of course, there's thousands of pieces of evidence, and the needle in the haystack is never large enough for people in these situations to be prepared. So, partly overconfidence, partly human error. Israel is caught entirely flat-footed in the afternoon of the day when many, many people are not watching TV. They're not picking up the phone. And so what happens? What happens at 2 p.m. to the Israelis when they're attacked?
Because it's Yom Kippur and because the country was wildly overconfident, the borders are defended by these skeleton crews of soldiers, some infantry, some tanks. The Suez Canal, which is the border between Israel and Egypt at that time, is manned by a few hundred guys. And there's no real plan for a surprise attack because Israel doesn't think that one is imminent. And the basic understanding was that the Egyptian army had been beaten so badly in 1967, 6 years earlier, that they would never dare attack again. That was really the assumption. And if there were plans for an attack, Israel assumed that it would know, that it would have forewarning and would be able to prepare. So no one saw it coming. And in retrospect, of course, there were signs that were missed. And this becomes a great scandal about how Israeli intelligence failed, about how the military failed, about how the political leadership failed. But that all happens after the war. At 2 p.m. on October 6th, no one has any idea that a war is about to break out, and then it does. And Egyptian forces surge across the Suez Canal and overrun the very scant Israeli defenses on the canal. And the same thing happens in the north of Israel on the Golan Heights. The Syrian army carpets the Golan with artillery and then surges into the Golan Heights, and the Israeli defenders on the Golan Heights fall back. And the first day or two or three, in fact, the first week of the Yom Kippur War is catastrophic for Israel. And the losses are so high that they're hidden from the public. And many Israelis only realize later that in the first week of the war, the army almost lost the Yom Kippur War. So it was pretty close, certainly in the first week of the war.
And then, but on that day, what's happening in the synagogues of Israel as religious and non-religious people find out what's going on? What do they do? How did they find out?
So at 2 p.m., it's kind of approaching the end of Yom Kippur. So they've already said this prayer, which we mentioned, this prayer called Unetane Tokef, which is that famous prayer that includes a list of ways that you could die in the coming year, who by water, who by fire. It's a pretty colorful text, who by wild animal, who by sword, who by strangulation, who by stoning, who by earthquake. That prayer has already been recited, and it's before the evening prayer, which is called Ne'ilah, or the locking, when the traditionally, the gates of heaven are locked and your fate is sealed. So in between those prayers, the war happens and sirens go off across the country. And the siren in Israel is a sound that we're familiar with. In fact, we're speaking on Yom HaZikaron, which is Israel's Remembrance Day, and a siren just went off across the country, which happens every year, and everyone stands and observes a minute of silence across the entire country. Cars stop on the busiest streets in Tel Aviv, and this very eerie siren just shuts everything down in Israel. And that was the same sound that people heard on Yom Kippur. Sirens went off, and everyone was very surprised because there had been no indication. The average Israeli had no indication that anything was coming. And then the radios come back on, right? There's no radio broadcast on Yom Kippur, but suddenly the radios start broadcasting again. And what they're broadcasting is call-up orders, these code names that are instructing Israeli men to report to their units. And that's when people start understanding that something very bad has happened, although the scale of it really only becomes apparent, a few days or even weeks later.
And I talked a little bit about this in the episode we did with Tyler Cowen about being an immigrant. I've been here 9 or 10 months, but the Army plays a very different role in Israel than it plays, say, in the United States or many other Western countries. Almost everyone is served outside of a couple groups. Some of the ultra-Orthodox don't serve. Many of the Arabs don't serve. They used to be drafted, but now it's optional. But the Army, other than that, everybody serves, and they serve for a long time. They don't just go for 2 or 3 years. They have to go to reserves as adults with families. They have to continue to be part of the Army in a way that's very alien, I think, to most Western listeners. So when you're talking about the code names, these are adults sitting or standing in synagogue or having gone home to take a nap in between these two services you mentioned, and they're suddenly finding their rifles and trying to get to where they need to get to.
That's right. So in Israel, you do several years of service after high school. At the moment, it's about 3 years for men and 2 years for women. And then you belong to a reserve unit. So the bulk of Israel's military force is actually reserves. It's people who are accountants or taxi drivers or, just regular civilians who have a reserve unit, do a few weeks of training or operational duty every year. And then in the case of an emergency, report in what's called, in Hebrew, it's called Tzav Shmone, an Order 8. An Order 8 is an emergency call-up. And when that happens, a code name is read out on the radio. These days, it would be, a WhatsApp message. And then you have to report to your base where you get fitted out with your gear, and then you head off. And that's what happened on Yom Kippur. So, the guys being called up weren't 18 or 19-year-old infantrymen. They were, 30-year-old school teachers and 40-year-old managers. And the country's, male population was basically mobilized. And that takes time. So before the reserves reach the front, or until the reserves reach the front, the standing army, which, as we said, was very scant along the borders, had to hold off these massive attacks until the bulk of the army could be moved down to Sinai and up to the Golan. And that took time. And while the reserves were on the move, the guys who were unlucky enough to be on the borders were being shredded.
So how does Leonard Cohen fit into this story?
It's kind of surprising to meet Leonard Cohen in this story. And, I think a lot of the soldiers who encountered him were quite surprised. I think Leonard Cohen was actually quite surprised to find himself in this story as well. I'm not sure that he had entirely been planning it, but at the time, he's living on a Greek island called Hydra, where he'd drifted over there in the 1960s. There was a bohemian scene on the island, and he has various versions of how he ended up there. In one version, he just says that he grew up in Montreal, of course. He's a Canadian from Montreal, so he's used to living in a place where you never see the sun, and it's, gray and freezing at least half the year. And then he showed up at this island and the sun was shining, and he said, so he, bought a white house and fell in love with a blonde woman and, and with the sunlight. And that was part of what was going on. The blonde woman is a reference to Marianne, who's kind of his legendary muse, about whom he writes the song "So Long, Marianne" and several other songs. But that Marianne is gone by the time the 73 war breaks out, and Cohen's on the island living with a woman with whom he has a very serious relationship. He calls her his wife in writing, although they weren't technically married. And they have a son. They have a 1-year-old son named Adam, Cohen's first child, and he's 39. So 39 is, a pretty significant year. It's a prime year for a crisis, and that's exactly what was happening to Leonard Cohen. I think that he was trying to have some kind of domestic life, and he felt trapped. He felt trapped by it, and in his own writing, it's clear that the war catches him at a low point. And Leonard Cohen struggled with depression for much of his life and was pursued by demons of various kinds and tried to escape them by, I guess, using some of the usual methods, mind-altering substances, women, but they don't always work. And in the fall of 1973, he's really struggling, and we know that thanks to a manuscript that he wrote. This incredibly honest, very raw, unfiltered manuscript that he wrote immediately after the war. And the manuscript was never published, but I was lucky enough to find it in a university library, in the McMaster University Library in Hamilton, Ontario, which is a strange place to find a great literary treasure. But this really is. And it's a 45-page typed manuscript in which Cohen's very honest about where his life is in the fall of 1973. So he's listening to the radio on this island, and he hears that a war has broken out in Israel. And surprising even himself, I think, and certainly surprising the people around him, he walks down the stairs on the island of Hydra. There are no cars on Hydra. So he walks down the stairs, down the hillside from this little white house where he's living with his partner, Suzanne, and their son, Adam. And he walks down to the docks, to the ferry docks, catches a ferry to Athens, somehow manages to get on a flight from Athens to Tel Aviv, which isn't that easy because the flights are being mobbed by Israeli men who are trying to get back to their units. And it's hard to get a seat on flights to Israel, but he manages to get on. And that's how he shows up in Tel Aviv at one of the worst moments of Israel's history in the fall of 1973.
And he doesn't have a guitar with him, right? He just shows up. He doesn't have a plan.
It's quite clear that he doesn't have a plan. So, when I initially started looking into this story, my assumption was that he had come to play for soldiers, but it seems clear that that's not the case. He came without a guitar, as you mentioned. He had announced his retirement from the music business, and he'd been very explicit about having kind of lost faith in his art. He told an interviewer that he just wants to shut up, that he doesn't have anything else to say. And this was known, this had been reported. So he wasn't coming as Leonard Cohen, the rock star. He didn't have plans to perform. It's quite clear. He meets some people and tells them that he wants to volunteer on a kibbutz, a communal farm in Israel. And that actually makes sense because that is something that a lot of volunteers from the West had done 6 years earlier in the 1967 war, because Israeli men are called up to the front. And that means that there's no one left behind to do the harvest, to pick the grapefruit, to pick the oranges. So Leonard Cohen thought he might be able to help out in that way, or so he told some of the people that he met. But his plans are altered by a chance meeting in a cafe in Tel Aviv a few days after he arrives in the country.
And what happens?
So he's at a cafe called Cafe Pinati, and Tel Aviv in those years, maybe some of your listeners have been here in recent years, but Tel Aviv at the moment is a very cool city. It's a pretty amazing international city, and it's got a beach, it's got a great art scene, and you can really have a great vacation in Tel Aviv. But Tel Aviv in 1973 was a very small place. Israel was a very small place. It was barely 3 million people at the time, and it was a country that was barely 25 years old, and many of the people in Israel at the time were refugees from Eastern Europe, people who had survived the Holocaust, people who had been driven out of their homes across the Islamic world, people from places like Morocco, Yemen, Syria, people living with very fresh memories of trauma and displacement. And the country was a very kind of odd mix of optimism and forward-looking ideology and very, very bad memories that people were either trying to remember or trying to forget. That's the country that Leonard Cohen shows up in. There are 2 bohemian cafes in Tel Aviv. One is called Cafe Kassit and one is called Cafe Pinati. And if you want to meet anyone who's important in the Israeli art scene, you go to one of those 2 cafes, you will meet basically everyone. And he was at one of them. He was at Pinati, and he was sitting at a table in the corner, according to some of the musicians who met him, some of whom I spoke to. And one of the singers, a pretty well-known Israeli singer named Oshik Levy, according to one version of what happened, he looks over and he sees Leonard Cohen sitting in the cafe. And Leonard Cohen was a major star. I mean, it's surprising to see him in Israel. He was a major international star. Israel was a very small country. People didn't really come here in those days. You wouldn't just see celebrities of that magnitude hanging out in Tel Aviv. Cohen had played in Israel the year before, and so he was known. He played a few concerts here, and people knew that Leonard Cohen was a big deal. And a second singer who was with Oshik Levy in that cafe, a woman named Ilana Rovina, didn't believe him. She said, "No way. There's no way that's Leonard Cohen in Tel Aviv in the middle of the Yom Kippur War." And Oshik Levy told her, "No, that's Leonard Cohen, and I'm going to prove it to you." And he walks over to the table and says, "Excuse me, are you Leonard Cohen?" And when the answer is yes, they all go over to his table and they talk him out of this plan that he has to work on a kibbutz. And they say, "No, you have to come with us. We're going down to the front to perform for soldiers." And he says yes.
And somebody finds him a guitar, and he's not a great guitarist. He's not a great singer. He's got a strange gravelly voice, and he kind of talks through his songs. His guitar style is very rudimentary. I happen to like it, but it's not everybody's cup of tea. And I'll just mention, if you haven't seen the movie McCabe and Mrs. Miller, watch it. The soundtrack is all Leonard Cohen songs, and they're unbelievable in that movie. They're extraordinary. So he gets a guitar. They head out. How many times roughly is he going to perform over the next few weeks?
So we don't really know. One of the first things that I did when I dived into this story, which, I began looking into this story in 2009. So it's 2022. It took me a long time to put it together. But one thing I hoped to find was a list of concerts.
Sure.
Because if it was a military tour, I was kind of thinking something like Bob Hope. There was probably a unit in charge of artists, and there was an officer who had a list, and we're going here, and now we're going here, and on this day. But that really is not the way Israel works, even in peacetime, and certainly not in wartime. The country is extremely chaotic and disorganized, which is part of its charm, and it can also drive you kind of crazy if you're trying to, get a driver's license or renew a passport. But you just get used to it. It's the Middle East. I grew up in Canada, so it's quite a transition from an extremely orderly society to this one. So I went to the IDF archive, the archive of the Israeli military, and I asked them which army unit would have been in charge of artists in the Yom Kippur War. Maybe there's a list. Maybe there's some kind of map of concerts. No, of course, there's no such thing. No one had any idea where these artists were most of the time. A lot of them were just driving around the front independently. This group of artists, so it's Cohen and kind of a pickup band of Israeli musicians, including people who went on to be some of the greatest musicians in Israel. It's a small group of people. It's Cohen and four musicians that they just get into a Ford Falcon owned by Oshik Levy, the singer, and they drive off to the war. That's really how it works. So no one had any idea where they were or where they were playing, and there is no list of concerts. So we don't know how many times he played or where exactly. So after that disappointing visit to the archive, I understood that the research was going to be more complicated than I'd expected. And what I was going to have to do was track down soldiers who had seen him. And I would have to, look for memories of these concerts in the minds of people who are now in their 70s. And I was going to have to look for photos of the concerts in the photo albums of soldiers who'd fought in the war. And it became a different kind of research, a much more interesting kind of research, a much more kind of human approach toward what is essentially underground history. This tour officially never happened. There's no record of it in the military archive. So there's no official record of it. It has to be reconstituted by putting together the pieces, and that of course makes it harder, but it also makes it much more interesting and gratifying when you succeed.
And it's part of the incredible charm of the book. How many soldiers do you think you spoke to?
Oh, I spoke to dozens of soldiers. Not all the stories are included in the book. I didn't want the book to be too long, and I didn't want to repeat myself. Some of the stories get repetitive, and what I was looking for was not just stories about the concerts, but stories about the war. Because the book is, as much as it's a book about Leonard Cohen and this really strange and fascinating moment in rock history, maybe one of the strangest moments in rock history, really. So it's about that, but it's also about the Yom Kippur War, because it's the war that lends the weight to the concerts. And what makes the concerts so potent and powerful is the fact that they're a matter of life and death. Cohen is playing for people who might be dead within a few hours. His song might be the last thing that they hear. And he knows that. And that makes the concert so potent. So if you don't explain what the war is, and if you don't explain who these soldiers are and what happened to them before the show and what happened to them after the show, then you don't get the incredible electricity of the concert. So the book is about the soldiers as much as it is about Cohen. And these very young Israelis who he meets at the worst moment of their lives are as much the stars of this concert tour as, the star himself, coming all the way from the great world beyond Israel.
When you're calling them concerts, they're 25 people sometimes sitting around the back of a truck with some other truck's lights shining on them. And it is incredibly informal most of the time. There are hardly any concert venues for this because it's literally, like you say, it's at the base where people are either going to be attacked soon or going to be attacking. It's incredibly visceral for the audience. But when we call it concerts, it's misleading perhaps.
That's right. People might be imagining, a stadium or
chairs,
chairs, right? There are no chairs. Or people might be thinking of a Bob Hope setup, with kind of a rear base and some kind of, more or less orderly setup far from the action. Or people might remember that famous scene from Apocalypse Now with the Playboy bunnies. It's kind of a famous scene from Apocalypse Now, but it wasn't like that at all. Cohen was really, for much of the time, really at the front. He was moving in a Jeep very close to the front lines. Their descriptions of what happens. I mean, Oshik Levy, who I met, he remembers them driving along in the dark on these roads in the desert, and they would just see a few artillery pieces parked in the sand, and they would stop and they would walk over to the soldiers who were, filthy and scared and depressed as soldiers are, and they would say, would you guys like to hear some songs? And if the soldiers said yes, then they would set up a stage. They would kind of put together an ad hoc stage made of crates of ammunition, and they would use the Jeep's headlights as spotlights. And there wasn't an amp most of the time, and they would just stand up on the crates and play. So Leonard Cohen, who'd been playing a few years before the 73 war, he was playing at the Isle of Wight festival, which was 500,000 people. It was bigger than Woodstock. And here he is playing for maybe 8 soldiers, 20 soldiers, maybe 30 soldiers if it was really big. And he would just stand up on these crates of ammunition and he would play, Suzanne to these soldiers, or he'd play, That's No Way to Say Goodbye. And it's just such a strange scene to imagine because the music is so distant from the experience of the soldiers. He's singing in English. We can assume that many of the soldiers did not understand English. And yet it seems clear that anyone who heard Cohen play in Sinai never forgot it. He made a huge impression, and the memory, lives on in Israel to this day. It was that potent.
And as you point out, many of them didn't know who he was. You say, he had come to Israel for a couple concerts. Well, people in the music scene knew who he was, but the average soldier probably had no idea who he was. Speak briefly. It's one of the more extraordinary parts of the book. You interviewed all these soldiers now in their older age, and many of them, of course, many of the participants in those performances died. Others have died since from natural causes. But one of the most remarkable things about this war is that you alluded to it in just a phrase. You said it was hard to get to Israel for Cohen because a lot of people, a lot of Israeli men were trying to get back to their units. And I think it's hard, again, for non-Israelis to appreciate the urgency with which people head toward conflict and violence in defense of their country, and what they did to get here, to get to Israel in time for the war, to be supportive of their, it's not just patriotism, of course, it's also the camaraderie that comes from war, and the people, they knew that their units were going to be in combat, and they weren't going to be sitting in Minneapolis or LA or New York or Paris. They were going to come home, and they did.
There are incredible descriptions of hundreds of Israelis camped out on the carpets at the airports in New York, at the airport in Paris, at Heathrow in London. People kind of desperate to get back to Israel, which is the opposite direction you'd think people would be moving in the middle of a war. And, there were so many people trying to get back that at first the army has lists of who can get on an airplane and who couldn't get on an airplane. And from the lists, you could understand how the war was going, because at first the people who they were letting on the airplanes back to Israel were tank crews and hospital staff. That's who they needed. So you can understand that the tanks were getting ripped up and that they had a lot of wounded. And as the war progressed, they started letting infantry officers and then infantry, and then and then other people could get back. But the planes were mobbed. And in my book, I have a few stories of people who were abroad when the war broke out and kind of fought and used any means necessary to get back to Israel. One of them was in Tokyo. One of the characters in the book who ends up taking some pretty incredible photographs of the war and of Leonard Cohen. And some of the others were in London and New York, and they make it back. They make it back to the front, and that's kind of an incredible part of the story. I think they were summoned in some strange way by the same force that calls Leonard Cohen to the war. There's this idea in Judaism that you don't stand by your brother's blood. There's a verse that
and stand idly by.
Yeah, that's right. You don't, if your brother's blood is being spilled, you don't stand next to it and watch. And that was definitely part of what drew Leonard Cohen to the war, whether he knew what he was going to do or not. The idea that this terrible thing would happen and he wouldn't be there. I mean, that idea seemed to be unbearable to him, and it drove him to take this really strange and surprising step of inserting himself into this Middle Eastern catastrophe.
You tell about an Israeli soldier, her name was Orly, who was on a base where Cohen was going to perform. He was exhausted. He needed a place to crash before the concert. And you write, one of the officers at the base, Tammy, came to Orly that afternoon and asked where Cohen could rest before the show. I was dying for him to sleep in my bed, Orly told me, not with me, but in my bed. I wasn't there. She offered her bed nonchalantly, so that the other girls wouldn't understand what it meant to her, so no one would steal Cohen and offer him their own bed. She and Tammy brought clean sheets. She sees Leonard Cohen's head on her pillow underneath the drawing of a mother and child. Orly was 19 at the time and a grandmother when she told the story. I didn't want any of the other girls to know who I had in my bed, she said. I had his songs in my ears. This is just somebody who did appreciate who Leonard Cohen was, and both his celebrity status and what he meant to her as a poet, as a songwriter, was that special that just having him sleep in her bed was enough.
That's right, and I had such a great time tracking down these soldiers, and actually Orly's had a pretty tragic story from the war. The war opens with an Egyptian missile attack on a radar station at Sharm el-Sheikh, which is at the very southern tip of Sinai. And Orly is there with a group of her friends. These are very young women who are in charge of radar screens. They're kind of in charge of watching the airspace to see any Egyptian incursion. And of course, one of the first things you do in a war is you knock out the enemy's radar. And they were there, and 5 of the young soldiers who were at this base were killed. And it was a very rough opening to the Yom Kippur War. After that Egyptian rocket attack on the base, because of confusion inside the army dispatches an armored force to attack the radar station, which they think has been captured by the Egyptians, when in fact it has not been captured by the Egyptians. So this armored force, just a few tanks, comes up the hill to the radar station and attacks the station and kills 2 more of the defenders of the radar station who were Israeli. So there was that phrase "friendly fire" always strikes me as being absurd, but that's what it was. It was Israelis killing each other, and this all happens right at the beginning of the war. And Orly's there, and that's when she meets Cohen. Cohen shows up at a large airfield next to the radar station not too long after that. So Cohen's meeting these people who might know his songs, and some of whom worship him like Orly, but he's meeting them minutes, days, maybe a week after really the worst moments of their lives. This is the audience for these shows, and it's what makes them so unique.
So Cohen writes a song, "Lover, Lover, Lover, Lover," during the tour, right, and starts performing it. Obviously, his plans for retirement. We'll talk a little bit about that song in a minute, but his plans for retirement are ended by events. And how would you summarize the impact of the war on him? What does it do to him?
Cohen's a kind of cagey character, and he doesn't like to discuss his process. So you can never really find Leonard Cohen being very transparent about what triggered a certain work of art or what led him in one direction and not in another direction. I think he wants his work to stand alone. He wants his poems to exist independently of whatever experience triggered them, and I respect that. I respect that, and I have a lot of respect for Leonard Cohen as an artist. But as a journalist, of course, that's what I'm looking for. I'm looking for some kind of factual explanation or factual background to the art that is produced by this great poet and great singer. So the Yom Kippur War, as we've said, meets Leonard Cohen at a moment that's not just a moment of personal crisis, it's a moment of professional crisis. And it's pretty clear to me that one of the things that leads him to the war is a desire to escape his own crisis. So Israel's crisis offers a way out of his more immediate crisis. And that's part of what's going on. And I think we should be honest about it. It's not all, pure, ideology or a desire to help the other. I think, he has a personal motive here, which is that he feels stuck and he spies an escape. And he ends up in a regional crisis, which takes his mind off his personal crisis.
He wouldn't be the first person to turn to the army for a way to avoid the rest of their lives. So
absolutely, I think many of us make decisions that have complex motivations, and things that we like to think of as altruistic are often partly altruistic, but there's usually something else going on, and that's fine. That's very human. And so he comes to the war, and then has these concerts which are quite extraordinary by all accounts. Concerts where no one is charging for tickets and no one's selling records and no money's changing hands. They're not filmed. No one even records them. There are a few scraps of audio, but not more than that. So this is pure art. It's a pure artistic transmission. It's not being sullied by any of the usual, aspects of the music business that Cohen hated. So in some way, it restores his faith in his art. And when he comes back, he's singing again. And actually, in this very strange manuscript that he writes about the war, one of his hopes for the visit to Israel, he says, "This is a place where I can sing again." He wants to sing again. He wants some way to get back on stage and restore his faith in his music, and that happens. It seems like an unlikely hope. Like, why would coming to Israel allow you to sing again? But that actually seems to happen. And we know that just a few months after the Yom Kippur War, not only is Leonard Cohen not retired, but he releases one of the best albums of his career, which is called New Skin for the Old Ceremony. That being a kind of, a wry reference to circumcision, maybe hinting at a kind of rebirth. And he has this album which includes Chelsea Hotel and Who I Fire and Lover, 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 and some of his greatest songs. So in some way that we can't completely define, the war restores Cohen's faith in his music and saves his career from oblivion. And it wouldn't have been a surprise, I think, if Cohen had retired at 39, right? We think about rock stars. You can't think of very many who make it past 39 or even make it to 39. And of course, in those years, many of them were dying at 27, like Hendrix and Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison. And 39 was pretty old. And yet Cohen goes on to have this extraordinary career over decades, which really lasts until he's in his early 80s. And, without the war, would we have had that later version of Cohen, the guy who writes Hallelujah, for example? I'm not sure.
Well, it's a shocking passage. It's so politically incorrect in today's world, but it's not an uncommon theme in literature, and that's that there are things about war that are attractive. And Cohen both writes in the journal that you had access to, and he also mentions it in an interview you quote, that war is wonderful. And at one point he calls it wonderful, another point he says it's okay, which is like a huge, seems like an overstatement. But he says war is people at their best. And he quotes a friend who said about LSD, "They'll never stamp this out," meaning it's too good. Most people who haven't seen war up close would say it's people at their worst, What do you think he was thinking? What do you think he experienced that brought him there?
He has some fantastic quotes about it. He almost never speaks about the war after the war. It's one of the interesting and strange things about this story. But immediately after the war itself, he gives an interview to a music magazine called Zigzag, which is a British magazine, and he explicitly discusses the war, and that's where the quotes that you're referring to come from. And he says that in a war, every gesture has meaning, and no one is goofing off, and everyone is focused on doing what needs to be done. And in some ways, it's people at their best, and that comes with it being a matter of life and death. And it's a very unique state of affairs for humans. And I tasted it to a very small extent in my own military service, and I think there's some truth to it. And of course, it's also people at their worst doing the absolute worst things that humanity can cook up. And that's all going on in a war, which makes it such a potent mix of emotions, such a potent mix of events and human behaviors. So for someone like Cohen, for someone as sensitive as Cohen, I think he couldn't help but be moved by it all, whether he was, impressed with the way people rose to the occasion and stood together and sacrificed for each other, or whether he was disgusted by the cruelty that humans demonstrate toward each other. And that's all very much present in his response to the war.
Yeah, at one point he said, under war, quote, "You think your life has meaning for a moment or two." He doesn't say it has meaning. He says you think. So it's about
not for very long.
Yeah, I think it's about right. I think it's about the heightening of emotion. As you said earlier, we're recording this on Yom HaZikaron, which is the day that Israel mourns its lost soldiers. It's the equivalent of Memorial Day in America. And Memorial Day in America is it's a mattress sale, and you go to a ball game. And here it's a much more somber day. I think about 2,500 people died in military action in the Yom Kippur War in Israel, in a country of 3 million at the time, as you said. So multiply that times 100, and you get 2,500, 25,000, 250,000 would be the equivalent, a little more than that, deaths in an American war, to give people a feel. And that's just in military. It doesn't include people who died in accidents and other things that are surely happened or related to the war. So it's a horrific moment for Israel. And in Israel, the Memorial Day is followed by Independence Day, Yom Ha'atzmaut. And Independence Day in the United States is more hot dogs and more ball games and more sales at the local mall. And in Israel, it's the visceral level of the celebration is very different, very intense. And the irony, or maybe it's not an irony, is that when you have a lot of death in your life, life is more precious and more exuberant. It does not, for whatever reason, it has not created a somber country. It's created an exuberant country. I don't know how long you've lived here, but having lived here 9 months, it's shocking to me how exuberant a people Israelis are, how much joy they have in life. And I think that's not unrelated to what they've experienced.
Yeah, I've been here for 27 years, and I agree with you. When the brink is very close, when you're standing at the edge of a cliff, then you are very aware of your senses, and you're very aware of being, just on the right side of the line. So, more than 24,000 Israelis have died creating and defending this country, and almost everyone here knows someone, is related to someone who died in one of the wars. And it's not that these things happened decades ago. We just lost about a dozen people in terror attacks a few weeks ago. So it's immediate for people here. So Memorial Day is not a holiday. It's really a somber day where people remember the people who they knew, who died in the wars. So we're not thinking about the Revolutionary War or even about the Vietnam War. This is a war that's ongoing. And that, I think, prevents it from becoming too theoretical for most Israelis. And as soon as Remembrance Day, as soon as Yom HaZikaron ends this evening, the parties start, because it's Independence Day. So there's this really jarring but kind of amazing transition from this very somber, very serious day of remembrance to concerts, fireworks, parties in the street. And that very much sums up what this country is about.
And the craziest thing for me as a newcomer is I'm looking at the schedule for concerts tonight when Independence Day starts. And at Independence Park, which is about a mile and a half from here, the first performer comes on at 9:30. And then somebody at 10:30, 11:30. The last performer comes on at 2:10 in the morning. And I have a feeling that there'll be a few people still dancing. Now, of course, there are two sides to a war. We haven't talked about, quote, the other side. But Cohen thought a lot about it. After the war ended, he had Cohen's Jewish. He came from a long line of religious Jews in Montreal. He was not religious in the common sense of the phrase himself, but it's clear he was haunted by Judaism in all his life. He can't escape it. That's what I meant earlier, the pole of tribe. His lyrics are often resonate with Jewish themes or quotes from prayers, as we've talked about. But after the war, he's very uncomfortable being pro-Israeli. He came, quote, for his brothers, and we'll talk about the song Lover, Lover, Lover. But after the war, he's very uncomfortable having taken a side, having chosen one side or another. And he later elides his experience in some way by saying he came to sing for Israelis and Egyptians, which of course he didn't. He didn't sing for Egyptians, but of course Egyptians died in friendly fire. Egyptians died in this war, and so Cohen found that almost immediately, it seems like after the war, the we call it the brotherhood or peoplehood that he felt under fire at the front. He doesn't want any part of that afterward.
Right, you really see it in his work during the war. He writes a verse of the song "Lover, Lover, Lover," where he explicitly calls the soldiers his brothers. He says, "I went down to the desert to help my brothers fight." He writes that line, but then erases that line, and you really see him erasing it in the notebook. He kind of crosses out that line, and ultimately that verse doesn't make it into the final version of Lover, 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 which comes out a few months after the war. And as you mentioned, he presents the song afterwards as having been written not for Israelis and Egyptians. He says, "I wrote it for the Egyptians and the Israelis." That's the order that he gives when he presents the song. So we can look at that in two ways. One is that, Cohen is a Jew, and as you say, he grew up in a very serious Jewish community in Montreal. He was a deeply religious guy. He wasn't an observant person, right, but he was deeply religious and, is speaking more or less directly to God throughout his life, including in his songs, arguing with God in a very kind of prophetic way that sometimes sounds like a version of some of the books of prophecy in Judaism, although of course they, written in a different language at a different time. But he's definitely someone who believes in God and thinks he has some kind of conversation with God, although he's not observant. So he comes and he asks the Israeli musicians who are touring with him, this kind of pickup band of musicians, he wants them to call him Eliezer, not Leonard. His Hebrew name is Eliezer Cohen. And when he's in Israel, he asks to be called Eliezer Cohen. So he's kind of gone native. And if you see the photos of Cohen in Sinai, you'll see that he's wearing something that looks like a uniform. And he's sleeping on the ground and eating combat rations and referring to the soldiers as his brothers. And then comes a breaking point close to the end of the war. And he writes about it in quite a striking way in this manuscript. He describes a scene at an airbase, and a helicopter lands. There's kind of a blast of rotors. A helicopter lands, and the medics start unloading wounded and dead soldiers from the helicopter. And these are guys who've been really banged up, really, really bad, and it seems to have been really hard to look at. And he was very upset by it. And someone came up to him and said, "Don't worry, Mr. Cohen. These are Egyptians." And he's relieved. He's relieved to hear that these aren't Israeli soldiers, right? They aren't from his side. And then he catches himself and he says, this relief that I just felt, I hate this relief. This is blood on your hands. Those are his words. So the fact that he was relieved that these soldiers were from his side and not from the other side.
From the other side and not
right,
from his side. Yeah.
Exactly. This was a kind of betrayal of his most dearly, his most deeply felt beliefs. And from that moment in the war, I think he starts pulling back and he remembers that he's a Jew and he's clearly here on one side of the war, but as a poet, his job is to address the universal. His subject is the human condition, and he can't be seen as being on one side of a war. In fact, he has to be seen as being bigger than any particular war. And that, I think, is why he obscures the context in which Lover, Lover, Lover was written. And that's why he never makes explicit the connection between his song Who by Fire and the Yom Kippur War. And that's why we meet him after the war claiming that he'd written the song for Egyptians and for Israelis. If you ask Leonard Cohen during the war, who's your enemy? He would never say the Egyptians, right? He would probably say, my enemy is inhumanity, or my enemy is war. Right? He had a very different idea of what he was doing. And you see that tension between his tribal allegiance and his universal leanings. And you see it really play out in a very, real and tangible way in his work around the Yom Kippur War.
I just want to mention, because it's so powerful. He writes a song right before he dies. He dies in 2015 or 2016?
2016.
Right before he dies, he writes and releases a song called You Want It Darker, and the you is God. And Cohen sings, if you are the dealer, I'm out of the game. If you are the healer, it means I'm broken and lame. If thine is the glory, then mine must be the shame. You want it darker, we killed the flame. Magnified, sanctified be thy holy name. Vilified, crucified in the human frame, a million candles burning for the help that never came. You want it darker. There's a reference there to the Jewish prayer of Kaddish, and the magnified, sanctified. But when he shares that song with a friend, the friend says, that's kind of a dark view of humanity. Can't you give me something a little cheerier for my children and our children and grandchildren? And Cohen's answer that you quote was, I don't write the songs. And I think that's one of the deepest things I think that an artist can say. They come from somewhere else. They both, either come from a source much higher. If you're a religious person, you might think they have a divine element, or you might think they write themselves because they're the product of all this stuff. But I love that line. I don't write the songs. Incredible.
Yeah, there's real honesty about Cohen. And that, I think, is what makes him much more durable than so many other artists who were more famous at the time. There are much bigger stars than Leonard Cohen throughout his career. And yet it's Cohen's music that endures, and his fame has only grown in a strange way since his death, which isn't what happens to most musicians. And it's because of his honesty, because of his facility with language, of course, because he's addressing those deep universal truths that make his songs so powerful and gives them such a long shelf life, right? Because the honesty of a guy who's 30 years old in the 1960s, if it's written right, it will ring true, in 2022, and it does.
So you spoke about how in the early days of the war, Israel's overrun, takes a lot of losses early on, but they hold. The line eventually holds, and Israel ends up, quote, winning the war. And in the aftermath of the war, they make peace. Israel makes peace with Egypt. Eventually makes peace of some kind with Jordan. They're not the best pieces, but they're much better than the past. Syria is still not a peaceful partner. So it's a victory. And yet I don't think there's ever been a war that felt like more of a defeat as you write about it. Why is that? And what did it do to Israel psychologically, to the Israeli people?
Israel does win the war, and the war ends with the Israeli army on the Egyptian side of the Suez Canal, and Israel encircles the Egyptian Third Army and has the Egyptians basically begging for a peace settlement by the end. And that's how.
And how long does that go?
It takes 3 weeks. It takes 3 weeks, and then there's this prolonged process of disengagement and disentanglement, and Henry Kissinger is running back and forth, doing shuttle diplomacy, and eventually there's a disengagement agreement that ultimately leads to a peace agreement, which is quite dramatic, as you mentioned. But as soon as the army has fended off the enemy and won the war, that's when the recriminations really start. And that's when Israelis start asking really hard questions about how we were caught off guard. How is it possible that a few hundred soldiers were supposed to hold the entire Egyptian border? Why was the army so disorganized? Why did we not have intelligence about the kind of anti-aircraft missiles that both Arab armies had been given by the Soviets, which really cripple the Israeli Air Force in the opening stage of the war? And people get very, very angry. And it starts with a small protest. It actually starts with one soldier who had been abandoned with his friends at an outpost in Sinai, and he's just standing with a sign outside one of the government offices in Jerusalem. And Golda Meir is the prime minister at the time, and it's still the same leadership that had founded the country 25 years early. It was the founding generation. It was the Labor Party. And this one guy with a sign kind of snowballs into a major protest. And there's a lot of fury about the way the war was handled. 2,600 fatalities in a country this small is an incredible blow, and someone needed to pay the price for it. And initially the government resists the calls to resign, but they have no choice. And eventually the government falls. And ultimately, 4 years after the war, the Labor Party loses power for the first time. They lose an election for the first time, and it's directly related to the war. And Likud comes to power under Menachem Begin. But it's not just the Labor Party that loses power. It's really the culture of the founding generation, that kind of optimistic kibbutz culture, the kind of music that was popular in Israel until 1973 is no longer popular. After 1973, this kind of upbeat Zionist type music, which is very on message and often performed by military entertainment troops, that whole style really, really goes out after 73. And what rises instead is a more introspective country, a country that's less concerned with we and more concerned with I. It's really, I guess, the beginning of the Israel that we have today, which is a very successful place in many ways, but less communal than it was, less utopian than it was, less optimistic than it was. And there are many reasons for that, of course. But the breaking point is really the Yom Kippur War, which for many Israelis has never ended. I mean, the trauma of the Yom Kippur War persists in the country to this day, and it pops up every year before Yom Kippur in the fall when more and more articles are published about the war, more books come out about the war, and you understand that for a big part of this country, October 6, 1973 is still going on.
Why do you think this move away from collective idealism and toward a more individualistic culture, why was that one of the responses? And I ask that partly as someone, again, as a newcomer who feels that this is a remarkably communal place relative to the United States I left less than a year ago. There is so much camaraderie on the streets. Israelis are famous for being brusque. Some would say rude, direct. They don't beat around the bush. And the metaphor I like is they're like a family. Families yell at each other. They can even hurt each other. But there's an underlying connection that I feel here as a newcomer. And yet you're suggesting that something was lost in 1973 that still isn't where it used to be. What is that, if you can explain it more thoroughly, or why do you think it happened?
Well, part of it is the eclipse of the kibbutz movement. So at the heart of the ethos of Israel in its first decades is this idea of the kibbutz, which is a communal farm. It's basically a communist experiment in radical equality and egalitarianism. And even though the majority of Israelis never lived on a kibbutz, that idea was at the heart of the country. And many of the country's leaders came from kibbutzim. And that really carries the country through its first decades. And that kibbutz leadership, the founding leadership of the country, is discredited by the Yom Kippur War because they mishandled the war and they mishandled the surprise attack, and they were shown to be blind and misguided, and it really undermined the confidence that people had in these pioneers who'd really wrought a miracle in Jewish history. I mean, 25 years before the Yom Kippur War, they created a state, that went against the entire course of history and revolutionized Jewish life forever. And they had a lot of credibility, of course, thanks to that. And the Yom Kippur War really ends that, period of grace, and a different kind of leadership arises, although, it doesn't happen all at once. And the kibbutz doesn't die all at once. And the kibbutz idea remains, and certainly the Zionist left remains influential through the 1990s. But the Yom Kippur War is really the beginning of the end of it. Part of it is that the world changed. So the communal ideals of communism, or even the 60s had a kind of communal feel to them. And that ends, in the 1970s. And, even in America, they talk about the me generation, and people worried less about the collective and more about themselves. And the idea of communal sacrifice takes a blow, maybe with Vietnam. And the world kind of shifts more toward the individual and less toward the great collectivist ideals of the early part of the 20th century. What's also happened here over the past 20, 30 years, and this is more in your line of business than mine, Russ, is capitalism, right? Israel abandons its kind of socialist leaning economy, although we never had a command economy here or anything like that, but it was a very government heavy economy, and the country was founded by radical socialists. So the DNA of the country remained red, red like socialist red, not like Republican red, for many, many years. And that changes 20, 30 years ago. Israel really goes capitalist, and Israelis turn out to be really good at capitalism. And that changes a lot, obviously not just economically, but socially. So you start seeing greater inequality, less social solidarity, much greater prosperity, and all of those things kind of happen at the same time. But I agree that this is still a much more communal place than the United States. So it feels much more tribal, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, and more familial, and people feel more connected to each other for better and worse, right? People here will, ask you without thinking twice how much you make, what you pay for rent.
Are you religious?
Are you religious? Why not?
Why'd you order that? Why did you buy that pineapple in your cart? My wife's shopping tells me somebody's complaining to her. That's overpriced. Why would you buy that? It's not that good.
Exactly.
Stranger.
You pay that much in rent, you're paying too much. You got to bargain. I mean, we had twins. I have twin sons who were born 15 years ago, and people would just stop us on the street in Jerusalem and ask us if they were natural or if it was in vitro fertilization. It happened all the time. So, that can kind of grate, but it's because people feel like it's because of that familial feeling. So it's still much greater than it is in the United States, but it's much less than it was even in 1995 when I moved to the country.
Yeah, one of the great things about Israel is, one of the bad things about Israel is the very different notion of privacy in every dimension. So they'll pick on you for what you ordered at the restaurant or at the grocery. They'll ask you about your kids. They'll pry into your private life, and they'll not just pry into it. They will editorialize about it afterward. And one of the great things about Israel is that privacy is really different. So my health app works. My health provider's app on my phone is so much better than what I experienced in the United States, because everything's connected without my permission. Yeah. You go to pump gas here. One of the strangest things for an American, they want the equivalent of your social security number, and they want you to enter it on the screen. First time I did that, when I'd rented a car, I thought, well, this must be wrong. And they obviously started asking for my Teudat Zahut, my social security, my identity number, and I must be misreading this acronym, for Teudat Zahut. But no, that's what they want. And I signed up for my lease, and the insurer wants to know my landlord's social security number equivalent. I said, why would I know that? So I write him, what is it? He sends it right back to me. These things would never, ever happen in America, and it makes life a lot easier. I'm sure there's some costs to it that are not good, but it's very, very different. Very, very different here.
It is very different. Also, by the way, that's a problem that some people run into when they try to transplant American political terminology to Israel. So when we use terms like left and right, Israelis also use terms like left and right. And to an American, that means something. So when we talk about the Israeli right, Americans might be imagining that it's like the American right in terms of individual rights and, abortion and things like that. And in fact, almost the entire Israeli right, were it transplanted to the United States, would be in the Democratic Party. In terms of all the issues that Americans care about, we don't have the same idea of privacy as you mentioned. Abortion is not controversial in Israel. Gun control is very, very tight in Israel, beyond the most fervent dreams of gun control advocates in the United States. Gay rights are not very controversial here. In fact, the most prominent gay politician in Knesset until last year was one of in Parliament, right? Was one of Netanyahu's most hawkish lieutenants, a guy named Amir Ohana, who's the Minister of Police. So the left-right division doesn't really track it's not the same if you're an American looking at this place. And what you mentioned about the ID number is a great example of something that Israelis don't even think about, or like socialized medicine, right? Everyone here has healthcare, single payer, it's state healthcare. That's not controversial. No one would imagine that anything else was possible. So of course, there are major differences.
There are a few people could imagine it, but yeah, it's not on the table here.
It's not on the table
in any real way. I want to mention we have an episode with Ron Abramitsky on the kibbutz experience. I also want to recommend the book "We Were the Future" by Yael Ne'eman. I don't know if I'm saying her last name correctly, but it's a memoir about growing up on a very, very egalitarian kibbutz and how strange it was. Very strange. Not so healthy, it would seem to me, but some people chose it and still would like to choose it. Let's close and talk a little bit about this transition that we mentioned earlier between Memorial Day and Independence Day. So I'm President Shalom College. Last night there was a circle of students singing sad songs for Yom HaZikaron, for Remembrance Day, and I wanted to be part of it, but I can't be, really. I don't know the songs. I don't know what the words mean in any real sense. And they asked me if I wanted to join the circle, and I think I said I can't, and I meant I don't belong. I haven't served in the Army. Every one of them has. I haven't lost a relative here in a war or a friend, and probably many of them have. So I'm an outsider who made Aliyah, what's called Aliyah. I joined the country. I'm an Israeli citizen. I still have an American passport. I'm still an American citizen, but I'm an Israeli citizen who, quote, doesn't belong. You've been here 27 years. You served in Lebanon. Do you feel you belong? Is your experience tonight, today, and last night, and tomorrow? I'm sure it's different from mine. But what's it like? Can you talk about it?
Yeah, I feel like I do belong. I mean, when I came, I was 17 years old, and I thought I was an adult. So for many, many years, I thought of myself as someone who'd come here as an adult. And then it's been 5 years ago or so, someone introduced me. We were just at a party or something, and someone said, "This is Matti. He's been here since he was a kid." And that was the first time I ever realized that I really came here when I was a kid. I thought of myself as an adult at 17, but I was young, and I caught the end of an Israeli childhood on this kibbutz where I ended up, and then went into the army with kids my age, and had that very intense, Israelization process of the military, of 3 years spent in an infantry unit, speaking Hebrew, doing what everyone else had to do, which in those years was this guerrilla war against Hezbollah in South Lebanon. And by the time I came out, I was local. I can look anyone in the eyes, and my contribution to the country isn't any less than anyone else's. And I married an Israeli, and my kids speak Hebrew. My kids have actually never been to North America. So I do feel like I fit in here at this point more than I fit in anywhere else, right? I only lived in Canada for 17 years, and I've been here for 27. So my entire life has been lived here, and I still have the eyes of an outsider, which helps me as a journalist. And, sometimes I find myself wondering where I am and, what this place is. That does happen to me on occasion. But at this point, I've lived here most of my life.
My guest today has been Matti Friedman. His book is Who by Fire. Matti, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.